There is a moment when you're standing in the dark and you realize the darkness goes deeper than you expected, where everything you thought you understood about a place simply stops making sense. That moment happened in the winter of 1961, in a small Australian town most people have never heard of, to two boys whose names were never written into any official record. They were not explorers, they were not archaeologists, they were not even particularly curious children by all accounts. They had simply gotten lost in the basement of their school during a game of hide and seek, slid through a gap in a crumbling wall, and come face to face with a door that had no business being there. A door sealed with a method that no one in the school, no one in the town, and eventually no one in the country could immediately explain. And what lay beyond that door, buried under decades of silence and bureaucratic indifference, would eventually force a handful of stubborn researchers to ask questions that the official history of this continent is still not entirely comfortable answering. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The school was called Harwick Primary, and it sat on the edge of a dry creek bed in a part of regional New South Wales that had been settled by Europeans in the 1840s. The building itself was old by Australian standards, constructed in 1889 with thick sandstone walls and a basement that the school board had officially decommissioned in 1934. After a ceiling collapse left a section of it structurally questionable, children were told not to go down there, which is, of course, precisely the kind of instruction that guarantees children will eventually go down there. The two boys, who have been referred to in the limited documentation that exists as Thomas and Barry, were 11 years old in July of 1961. It was a Thursday during the lunch recess that most of the school spent outside in the pale winter sunlight. Thomas and Barry had other ideas. They had discovered some weeks earlier that the padlock on the basement door had been fitted incorrectly, so that if you lifted the door slightly on its hinges while turning the hasp, the lock disengaged without a key. Children discover these things. They always do. They were not down there for any particular reason beyond the specific pleasure of being somewhere they were not supposed to be. The basement was long, low-ceilinged, and smelled of damp stone and something else, something older, something that both boys would later describe independently as similar to the smell of a very old book. The light from the single torch Thomas had brought was not strong enough to illuminate the far end of the space, and so they moved carefully past broken furniture and stacked crates and the skeletal remains of what had once been a boiler, and deeper into the room than either of them had gone before. The gap in the wall was not obvious. It appeared at first glance to be simply a section of fallen masonry where a portion of the interior wall had given way. The stones had tumbled inward rather than outward, which meant the gap they left was irregular and partially obscured by the debris itself. Thomas, who was smaller, went through first. Barry followed. And on the other side of that gap, in a space that was clearly not original to the 1889 building, there was the door. It was set into the far wall of a small antechamber. The antechamber itself was roughly rectangular, perhaps 4 meters by 3 meters, cut directly into what would have been the sandstone bedrock beneath the school's foundations. The walls were not the rough-hewn work of colonial-era builders. They were smooth in a way that made both boys run their hands over them, confused, and the door was not wood, not iron, not any material either of them could immediately name. It was dark, slightly reddish in places, And when Barry pressed his palm flat against it, it was cold in a way that seemed excessive given that the rest of the room was merely cool. The seal around the edges of the door was not mortar, it was something else. Something that had been applied in careful, deliberate layers and had hardened over a span of time that, as would later become apparent, was far longer than anyone in that school, or that town, or that country was prepared to accept. They did not open it. Barry would say later, when he was in his 70s and finally agreed to speak about it at length, that it simply did not occur to them to try. There was something about the door, he said, that made you feel you should not in a frightening way, in the way that you feel when you are standing at the edge of something very large and very deep. You do not step forward, not because something stops you, because something in you understands that stepping forward would change things in a way you cannot take back. They went back through the gap in the wall, they went upstairs. They did not tell anyone about what they had found, not their parents, not their teacher, not the headmaster. They went back to class when the bell rang and they sat through the afternoon, and they went home and they ate dinner and they slept. And for 17 years, neither of them said a word about the door beneath Harwick Primary School. It is worth pausing here to understand why that silence is not surprising. In 1961, in regional New South Wales, the official narrative of Australian prehistory was straightforward and largely unchallenged at the level of public education and community knowledge. Australia had been settled by Aboriginal peoples who were understood, in the framework of the era, to be a prehistoric people without architecture, without permanent structures, without the kind of material culture that produced sealed rooms beneath the ground. The European settlers had arrived in 1788. Before that, as far as most Australians in 1961 were taught and believed, there was simply the land and its original inhabitants, living as they always had. A sealed door in the bedrock beneath a colonial-era school did not fit into that story. And so, in the way that things which do not fit into a story are handled by the human mind, particularly by the minds of children who understand instinctively that adults do not want to hear certain things, the door was filed away in the category of things that had happened, but that could not be explained and therefore could not be discussed. It stayed there for 17 years. What brought it forward was not Thomas or Barry, it was a drought. The summer of 1978 was brutal in that part of New South Wales, and the old creek bed that ran beside the school had been completely dry for months. The school board, looking at the cracking foundations of the 1889 building and the damage that the dry season was doing to the surrounding ground, commissioned a structural survey. The surveying firm they hired was based in Sydney, and the engineer they sent was a man named Robert Canfield, who had no particular connection to the town and no stake in any version of its history. He was there to assess the foundations and file a report. He found the antechamber on his second day of work. He had a proper torch, better than anything Thomas and Barry had carried, and he was methodical in the way that engineers are methodical, which is to say he measured and photographed everything he encountered. His photographs of the door and the antechamber were eventually, through a chain of events he did not anticipate, included in a letter he wrote to a colleague at the University of Sydney, who had an interest in pre-colonial Australian archaeology. The colleague's name was Dr. Margaret Ashwood, and she drove to the town the following weekend and stood in the antechamber for 45 minutes without saying anything. What she was looking at, she would write in her private notes from that visit, was a room that should not exist. Not because rooms cannot exist beneath schools, they can and do, but because the techniques evident in the construction of this particular room were inconsistent with anything she knew of colonial era Australian construction methods, and equally inconsistent with what she understood of traditional Aboriginal construction practices, which did not, in the academic consensus of 1978, include the creation of sealed subterranean chambers in sandstone bedrock. The walls of the antechamber showed evidence of having been worked with tools that left a specific kind of mark. Not the chisel marks of European stonemasons, which she had seen in any number of colonial era buildings. Something different. A pattern of shallow parallel striations that suggested a tool with multiple cutting edges, applied in overlapping passes. The smoothness of the finished surface was not the smoothness of sandstone that has been worn by water or weather. It was the smoothness of sandstone that has been worked deliberately, repeatedly, and with considerable skill. The seal around the door was the thing that made her stand there for 45 minutes. She had brought with her a small kit that she carried on field visits, and she used a dental pick to take a tiny sample from the edge of the seal material, placing it carefully in a glass vial. She did not know at that point what the seal was made of. She knew what it was not made of. It was not lime mortar. It was not clay. It was not pitch or resin of any kind that she could identify by sight or smell. It was a pale material, slightly translucent, with a texture that reminded her, she wrote, of something halfway between hardened beeswax and old bone. She drove back to Sydney with the vial and 2 rolls of photographs and a growing conviction that she was either going to ruin her career or change it entirely, and she was not yet sure which. The analysis of the seal material took 11 months, partly because of the methodological care required, and partly because the first laboratory she sent it to returned results that she did not trust, and she sent a second sample to a different facility. The results from both facilities were, within their respective margins of error, consistent with each other. The seal material was organic. It contained compounds consistent with a highly processed plant resin of a type that, as far as anyone could determine, was not native to the region in which it had been found, and the radiocarbon dating, run twice, came back with a range that Dr. Ashwood stared at for a long time before she picked up the phone. The seal had been applied, according to the dating, somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 years ago. That meant the antechamber beneath Harwick Primary School, and whatever lay behind the door within it, had been constructed at a point in time that preceded the European settlement of Australia by more than 3 millennia. It predated the establishment of the first British colony in New South Wales by somewhere between 3,000 and 3,400 years. It was, by any reasonable measure, older than the concept of Australia as a European political entity. Older, in fact, than most of what most Australians in 1978 would have thought of as ancient history. It was also, and this was the part that Dr. Ashwood found most difficult to process, inconsistent with the archaeological understanding of Aboriginal material culture that dominated the academic consensus at the time, which created a problem that had no comfortable resolution. Either the academic consensus was wrong or something else entirely was going on. She chose, in the end, not to publish. This is a decision that has been criticized since, and that she herself, in the last years of her life, said she regretted. But in 1979, with two contested radiocarbon dates and a set of photographs and a vial of processed plant resin, and with a career that was not yet senior enough to absorb the kind of challenge she was contemplating, she chose to file her notes, send copies to a small number of colleagues she trusted, and wait. She told herself she was waiting for more evidence. She was probably also, she acknowledged later, waiting for courage. The courage arrived in a form she had not anticipated in 1987. By that point, Harwick Primary had been partially demolished and rebuilt. The 1889 sandstone sections had been assessed as structurally compromised and taken down, replaced with a modern brick building set back slightly from the original footprint. In the process of demolition and excavation, construction workers had opened up the ground beneath the old building and had, in the course of their work, encountered the antechamber again. They had photographed it with a Polaroid camera, noted it in their site log as a historical feature, and reported it to the local council as required. The council had filed the report. The antechamber had been, after a brief discussion about heritage obligations and construction timelines and the cost of delays, sealed over with concrete. The door was still behind it. This information reached Dr. Ashwood through one of the colleagues she had sent her notes to 8 years earlier, a man named Dr. Peter Lindquist, who had retained his copy of her documentation and who had, in the intervening years, become considerably more senior in his field. He was angry about the concrete. He was angry in the specific way that archaeologists become angry when things that should have been preserved have instead been buried again, this time under a material that would be far more difficult to work around. He called Dr. Ashwood and told her that if she was ever going to do anything with what she had found, she needed to do it now because the window was not going to stay open. She published a preliminary paper in 1988. It was careful, measured, and extensively hedged. It described the antechamber as a feature of unknown origin, exhibiting construction characteristics inconsistent with documented colonial era and traditional Aboriginal building practices, and presented the radiocarbon dating results as preliminary findings requiring further investigation. She made no claims about what the feature was or who had built it. She simply put the data in front of her colleagues and waited. The response was, in equal measure, dismissive and alarmed. Dismissive because the prevailing academic consensus held that the pre-colonial history of Australia, while rich in many respects, did not include permanent subterranean construction of the type she was describing. Alarmed because a small number of people who read the paper recognized in the details she had included something that connected in uncomfortable ways to a set of questions that had been circulating quietly at the edges of Australian archaeology for several decades. Those questions had to do with contact, specifically with the possibility that Australia had been visited and possibly settled temporarily by seafaring peoples from outside the continent at a point in time significantly earlier than the first confirmed European arrival in the 17th century. This was not, in 1988, a new idea. There was a body of evidence, disputed and contested but not entirely dismissible, that pointed toward pre-European contact between Australia and the civilizations of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and possibly regions further afield. Rock art in the Northern Territory that showed figures in styles with no parallel in the broader corpus of Aboriginal visual culture. Linguistic anomalies that had been noted by early European settlers and subsequently debated by generations of scholars. Botanical evidence suggesting the presence of cultivated plant species that had no obvious pathway to Australia under the assumption of complete pre-European isolation. And now, in the sediment of that evidence, there was a sealed antechamber in the bedrock of New South Wales, with walls worked in an unfamiliar technique and a door sealed with a resin of non-native plant origin, dated to the late Bronze Age. Dr. Ashwood's paper did not resolve these questions, it added to them, and the fact that the antechamber itself was now inaccessible, buried under fresh concrete beneath the new Harwick Primary building, meant that the questions it raised could not, in the short term, be answered by further investigation of the physical site. What could be investigated, and what was investigated over the following decade by a loose network of researchers who had been drawn into the orbit of Ashwood's paper, was everything around the site, the history of the land, the records of previous construction, the oral traditions of the Aboriginal communities whose country included the area where Harwick Primary stood, the geological character of the sandstone in which the antechamber had been cut, the distribution of similar features, if any existed, elsewhere in the region. What they found was not a single smoking gun. It was a collection of threads, each of them individually explicable, but collectively pointing in a direction that the mainstream of Australian historical scholarship was not, in the 1990s, ready to follow. The land on which Harwick Primary stood had been granted to a settler family in 1843. Before that, it had been what the early surveyors' reports described as unimproved land, meaning land that had not been developed by European settlers. But the Aboriginal communities in the region had not described it as unimproved. They had described it in the language recorded by early missionaries and administrators as a place of considerable significance, a site associated with what the translators of the era rendered as the old ones or the people before. These terms were understood by the Europeans who recorded them as references to ancestral spirits or mythological figures, which is how European observers of that period typically categorized anything in Aboriginal oral tradition that they could not immediately map onto a material reality they recognized. But the people who said those words had not said spirits, they had said people, the people before. And when researchers in the 1990s, working with contemporary Aboriginal community members and elders, went back to those early records and looked carefully at the original language rather than the translations, they found that the distinction mattered. The place had been described consistently across multiple early records from different observers in different decades as a place where a different people had once lived, not spirits, not ancestors in the mythological sense. People who had come from somewhere else, lived in the ground, and eventually gone away. This is the kind of testimony that mainstream scholarship treats with extreme caution for reasons that are not entirely without merit. Oral traditions are complex, translations are imperfect. The terms that early European observers used to record what they heard were shaped by their own frameworks and assumptions, which were often wildly inadequate to the task of capturing the actual content of what Aboriginal peoples were telling them. It is entirely possible to look at these early records and conclude that what they captured was a garbled, filtered version of something that was being said in a context and with a meaning very different from what the words translated and recorded by a British missionary or colonial administrator appear to convey. It is also possible to look at those records in light of the antechamber at Harwick Primary and think that maybe the people who said there had once been different people living in the ground in this place were describing something they actually knew about. Thomas and Barry were both still alive in 1993. Dr. Ashwood, aware by then that they existed through the records of the 1961 school enrollment she had eventually been able to access, spent 4 months trying to find them. She found Thomas first. He was 53 years old, living in Brisbane, working in the insurance industry, and he agreed to meet her for coffee in the lobby of a hotel near his office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was polite and slightly wary, and he confirmed without much apparent emotion that yes, he had been in the basement of Harwick Primary in 1961, and yes, he had seen the antechamber and the door, and no, he had not told anyone about it for a very long time. He had eventually told his wife sometime in the 1980s. She had not known what to make of it. He did not particularly know what to make of it either. He had simply filed it in the same place he had filed it as a child, in the category of things that happened but that could not be explained. He remembered the door very clearly. He remembered the cold of it. He remembered the quality of the seal around its edges. He described the seal as looking like it had been applied carefully, like someone had taken considerable time and care to make sure nothing could get through it. He remembered that the door itself seemed to be slightly recessed into the frame around it, not flush with the wall, but set back by perhaps a centimeter, as though it had been designed to be opened by pulling rather than pushing. He did not know what it was made of. He still did not know. It had not looked like any material he could identify, either as a child or as an adult who had looked over the years at photographs of various materials and wondered. Barry took longer to find and was less willing to talk. He was living in a small town west of Adelaide, and he had clearly thought about the antechamber more than Thomas had, or at least had thought about it differently. Where Thomas seemed to have stored the memory in amber, preserved but sealed off, Barry had worried at it. He had, over the years, read what he could find about Australian prehistory and unexplained archaeological features, which in the pre-internet era had meant spending time in libraries and occasionally writing letters to universities that went mostly unanswered. He had not, he told Dr. Ashwood when she finally reached him by phone and convinced him to speak, come to any conclusions. But he had developed a strong feeling that what they had found mattered, and a correspondingly strong frustration that it had been buried under concrete without anyone properly investigating it. He was, by the time he spoke to Dr. Ashwood, 63 years old and somewhat unwell, and he was precise and detailed in a way that spoke to years of careful recollection. He remembered things that Thomas had not mentioned. He remembered that there were marks on the walls of the antechamber that he had not been able to see clearly with Thomas's torch, but which had been visible at the edges of the torchlight as a kind of pattern. Not words, he said, or at least not anything that looked like words to him, more like a repeated shape. He had tried over the years to draw it from memory. He had never been satisfied with any of his drawings. The best approximation he could offer was that it was something like a series of arcs nested inside each other, repeated at regular intervals around the walls, like someone had taken the shape of a wave and formalized it, made it precise and geometric, and then carved it into the stone at a consistent height, all the way around the room. This detail, which Dr. Ashwood had not encountered in Canfield's photographs because his torch angle had not captured it, or in her own visit because she had been focused on the door and the seal, became one of the more significant threads in the subsequent research. The pattern Barry described, arcs nested within arcs in a regular repeating sequence, had parallels, not obvious parallels, not the kind of parallels that allow you to say this connects directly, and certainly to that, but suggestive ones in the rock art of coastal Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, in the carved stone friezes of pre-Vedic sites in southern India, in the decorative vocabulary of the Lapita culture, the seafaring people who had colonized much of the Pacific beginning around 3,500 years ago, which overlapped almost precisely with the radiocarbon date range on the seal at Harwick Primary. The Lapita culture is not well known outside of Pacific archaeology, but it represents one of the most remarkable achievements of pre-modern maritime civilization. Beginning somewhere in the region of the Bismarck Archipelago, north of New Guinea, the Lapita people spread across the Pacific over roughly 1,000 years, reaching Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, and eventually, in later cultural forms, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. They were extraordinary navigators, extraordinary potters, and extraordinary builders of the kind of cultural connections across vast ocean distances that most people in the modern era assume were impossible without modern technology. They left behind, as evidence of their presence, a characteristic pottery style decorated with geometric patterns that have been studied extensively and that share, in certain of their decorative elements, characteristics with what Barry described seeing on the walls of the antechamber. This does not mean the antechamber was built by Lapita people. The Lapita cultural sphere, as documented, does not extend to southeastern Australia, and there is no established evidence of Lapita settlement on the Australian continent. But it raises a question. If the maritime cultures of the Pacific were capable of the oceanic crossings that their own archaeological record documents, and if those crossings were occurring at a time consistent with the radiocarbon date on the Harwick primary seal, then the possibility that some of those crossings extended further to the coastlines of the Australian continent is not inherently impossible. It is simply undocumented. Undocumented is not the same as impossible. This is a distinction that matters enormously in a field where the absence of documentation is often treated as equivalent to evidence of absence, which it is not. Dr. Ashwood published a second paper in 1997, considerably less hedged than the first. In it, she laid out the cumulative case for treating the Harwick primary antechamber as a feature of genuine pre-colonial significance, constructed by a people whose identity remained unknown, but whose material culture pointed toward connections with maritime civilizations of the broader Indo-Pacific region. She was careful. She was explicit about what was established and what was speculative. She was also explicit, for the first time in print, about the fact that the feature had been sealed over by a local council that had decided its preservation was less important than a construction timeline. The paper was reviewed with more seriousness than the 1988 piece had been, partly because the field had shifted slightly in the intervening decade, and partly because Dr. Ashwood was now considerably more senior, and the arguments she was making were harder to dismiss on purely professional grounds. It generated debate. It generated pushback. It also generated a small but significant coalition of researchers who were willing to treat the questions it raised as legitimate rather than fringe. Among those researchers was a geologist named Dr. Francis Okafor, whose particular interest was in the analysis of ancient construction techniques through the study of tool marks in stone. He had not been part of the original investigation. He had read Ashwood's 1997 paper and written to her, and they had subsequently spent several years corresponding and eventually collaborating. His contribution to the Harwick primary question was methodological. He developed a technique for analyzing the photographic documentation of the antechamber walls in ways that extracted more information than had originally been possible from Canfield's photographs and Ashwood's own photographs, using enhancement methods that were not available in the earlier period. What the enhanced photographs showed when Okafor had finished with them was a tool mark pattern that he was able to characterize with considerable specificity. The tool used to work the walls of the antechamber had multiple cutting edges arranged in a specific geometric configuration. The spacing between those edges and the depth and angle of the marks they left were consistent with a class of tools that had been documented archaeologically in a number of sites across Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, but that had no documented equivalent in the archaeological record of Australia, either in the pre-colonial period or the colonial period. He was also able, from the photographs, to characterize the sequence in which the marks had been made, which told him something about the technique of the people who had made them. They had worked systematically in organized passes across each wall section, maintaining consistent pressure and angle throughout. This was not the work of unskilled hands. This was practice technique, applied by people who had done this before and who knew exactly what result they were producing. His paper, co-authored with Dr. Ashwood and published in 2001, was the most technically rigorous document to emerge from the Harwick primary investigation. It was also the one that prompted the most direct response from the established archaeological community, some of which was supportive and some of which was not. The not supportive response tended to cluster around the argument that the tool mark analysis, however technically accomplished, was being used to support a conclusion that the broader evidence did not justify, namely, that the antechamber had been built by a non-Aboriginal, non-European people at a time 3,000 years before European settlement. This was, the critics argued, an extraordinary claim that required extraordinary evidence, and the available evidence, while suggestive, did not rise to that standard. This is a fair objection as far as it goes, and Dr. Ashwood and Dr. Okafor did not dispute it in principle. Their position was that the evidence was sufficient to justify taking the question seriously, which was different from claiming to have answered it. The distinction was perhaps too fine to survive the often blunt instrument of academic debate, and the Harwick primary papers spent most of the first decade of the 21st century in a kind of limbo, cited occasionally in surveys of contested Australian prehistory and ignored by the mainstream of the field. What changed things again, as things in this kind of slow, stubborn, contested investigation tend to change, was something that had nothing directly to do with the antechamber itself. In 2009, a team of researchers from 3 Australian universities, working in collaboration with a group of geneticists based in Copenhagen, published a study of ancient DNA extracted from skeletal material found at a series of sites along the eastern coast of Australia. Material that dated to various points in the period between 4,000 and 1,200 years before present. The study was primarily concerned with questions of population continuity and migration within Australia over that period, which is a complex and still contested area of research. But in the course of their analysis, the researchers identified in several of the samples from the older end of their date range genetic markers that were inconsistent with the population structure of the Aboriginal Australian lineages they had been using as a reference. The markers were not European in origin. They were not consistent with any population that had documented historical presence in Australia. They were, the researchers noted in a brief and carefully worded section of their paper, most closely affiliated in terms of genetic distance with populations from a broad region encompassing southern India, Sri Lanka, and the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent. This finding was presented as a preliminary and unexplained result requiring further investigation, which is the appropriate way to handle genetic anomalies that do not fit established frameworks. It did not make headlines. It was noted by a small number of people who were already paying attention to questions of pre-colonial contact with Australia, and then it sat in the literature, waiting. Dr. Ashwood was one of the people who noted it. She was 71 years old in 2009, and she had not published anything on the Harwick primary matter in several years. But she had not stopped thinking about it. The genetic paper reactivated something for her. She wrote a commentary piece for a small Australian archaeology journal in which she connected the genetic finding to the Harwick primary evidence and to the broader body of contested pre-colonial contact research. And she argued plainly and without excessive hedging that the cumulative picture was one that could no longer be responsibly ignored. She also, in that commentary, mentioned for the first time in print the name of the school, the year of the original discovery, and the names Thomas and Barry, though she gave only their first names. She did this because she believed that the human dimension of the story mattered, that the fact of two 11-year-old boys stumbling into an antechamber that no one in their world could explain, and then spending 17 years and more in silence about it because the world they lived in had no category for what they had found, was itself a form of evidence about how these things work. How discoveries that do not fit the available frameworks are not always suppressed by conspiracy or deliberate concealment. Sometimes they are suppressed simply by the absence of a language in which they can be discussed, by the impossibility of fitting them into any available story. Barry read the commentary. He was 79 years old. He wrote Dr. Ashwood a letter, his first contact with her since their phone conversation 16 years earlier. In the letter, he said that he was glad she had written it and that he thought it was probably the most honest description of the situation he had read, which was not a large field to be the most honest in, but which he thought counted for something. He also said something that she quoted in a later interview. He said that he had thought about the door for more than 4 decades, and that the thing which had never left him was not what was behind it, because he did not know what was behind it and had made his peace with the likelihood that he never would. The thing that had never left him was what it felt like to stand in that room at 11 years old and understand, in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have the language to say them, that the world was older than anyone had told him. The world was older than anyone had told him. That sentence is worth staying with for a moment. Because what the Harwick primary antechamber represents, in the larger story of what we know and do not know about the human past in Australia, and in the broader Indo-Pacific region, is precisely that. A collision between the world as it has been officially narrated and the world as it actually was. These collisions are not unique to Australia. They happen wherever the documentary record of human history, which is a thin and recent and geographically biased thing, encounters the physical record of human activity, which is far older and far more complex and far less tidy than any narrative built on documents can accommodate. Australia is, in some respects, a particularly acute case. The official history of the continent, the history taught in schools and held in the cultural consciousness of the country, begins in 1788. Everything before that is categorized as prehistory, a term that carries within it, even now, a faint suggestion of something that was not quite real yet, not quite articulate, not quite part of the story that matters. The extraordinary depth and complexity of Aboriginal Australian cultures, their art, their law, their detailed knowledge of the continent's ecology and geography, their systems of trade and ceremony that connected communities across thousands of kilometers, are acknowledged and increasingly celebrated, but they tend to be acknowledged in a framework that still treats 1788 as the moment when Australia's history, in the full sense, began. The antechamber at Harwick Primary does not fit into that framework. It does not fit into it at two separate levels. First, because it suggests the presence in pre-colonial Australia of people whose material culture does not match what is documented for Aboriginal communities of that period, which forces questions about what we actually know and don't know about the full range of human activity on the continent over the past several millennia. Second, because even if we set aside the question of who built the antechamber and simply consider the question of what the Aboriginal communities in the region knew about it, the answer implied by those early missionary and colonial records, the ones that mentioned a different people who had once lived in the ground in that place, suggests that the oral traditions of the country's original inhabitants contain information about that pre-colonial past that the official history has not yet found a way to incorporate. This is not a small thing. Oral traditions are not simply stories. In cultures where writing did not exist, oral tradition was the primary technology for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The systems developed by Aboriginal Australians for the maintenance of oral tradition are, by any careful measure, extraordinarily sophisticated. The evidence that those traditions preserve accurate information about events thousands of years in the past is not merely theoretical. There are documented cases in which Aboriginal oral traditions have been found to contain accurate descriptions of geological events, including volcanic eruptions and significant coastal changes resulting from post-glacial sea level rise, that occurred at points in time ranging from several hundred to more than 10,000 years before the traditions were recorded. The precision of this preservation is not something that should be surprising to anyone who has studied how oral tradition actually works in practice, but it is something that the official history of Australia has been slow to take seriously, partly because taking it seriously requires revising a number of assumptions about the nature of the pre-colonial past that have been deeply embedded in the national narrative for a long time. The revision is happening, slowly, unevenly, with the resistance that always accompanies the revision of deeply held assumptions, but it is happening. The genetic research that began to complicate the simple picture of Australian prehistory in the 2000s and 2010s has continued, and the complications have accumulated. The linguistic research connecting certain Australian Aboriginal languages to language families outside the continent has moved from the margins of the field toward something approaching a mainstream debate. The rock art of the Kimberley and the Northern Territory continues to generate careful, serious, scholarly attention from researchers who are asking questions about its origins and its chronology that would not have been asked in the framework of 1961 or even 1988. And the antechamber is still there. Under the concrete and the brick of the current Harwick Primary Building, which is itself now old enough to show its age, the sealed room sits in the bedrock of the New South Wales landscape and waits. The door is still in it. The seal around the door is presumably still intact, given that it survived 3,000 years in that condition. Whatever lies behind the door has not been reached by anyone who has published a record of having done so. There have been periodic efforts over the years to have the site formally assessed for heritage protection and possible excavation. These efforts have encountered the familiar obstacles that attend any archaeological interest in a site that is currently occupied by an active school in a jurisdiction where heritage law requires balancing the preservation of historical features against the practical interests of current occupants, and where the historical significance of the feature in question is officially still contested. The Nessadollars Heritage Office has the Harwick primary site on a list of locations under consideration for further assessment. It has been on that list since 2004. The school continues to operate. The children who attend it do not know what is under their feet because why would they? They are at school. They are thinking about other things. Thomas died in 2016. He was 76 years old and had lived, by his own account in the last interview he gave, a life that he was satisfied with. He said in that interview that he had thought about the antechamber less and less as he got older, and that he was at peace with not knowing what it was. He said that some things are not meant to be understood by the people who find them, that sometimes you are just the person who opens a gap in a wall and sees a door, and that being that person is its own kind of thing, even if you never find out what is behind the door. Barry outlived him by 3 years, dying in 2019 at the age of 89. In the weeks before he died, he spoke several times to a researcher at the University of Sydney who had been drawn into the Harwick primary question through Dr. Ashwood's work, a young woman named Dr. Claire Whitfield, who was at the beginning of what would prove to be a significant career in Australian prehistory. Barry told her in those conversations everything he remembered in more detail than he had given to anyone before, including the details about the pattern on the walls. He said he wanted it on record. He said he did not care if anyone believed him. He said that what he had seen was real and that it mattered, and that he did not want to die having kept it entirely to himself. Dr. Whitfield has been working with the enhanced photographic record and the documentation from Ashwood and Okafor and the genetic research and the oral tradition records, and she has been building carefully and with considerable methodological rigor a picture of the Harwick primary site that she hopes to present eventually in a form that will be taken seriously enough to generate the kind of formal attention that could result in a proper excavation. She is aware that this is a long path. She is aware that the case for reopening the site will have to be made in a political and institutional environment that has reasons for caution that are not always purely academic. She is aware that what she is trying to do is argue for a revision, not a wholesale rejection of the established narrative of Australian prehistory, and that revisions of this kind take time. She is also aware, and she has said this in print, that the stakes are not only academic. The communities whose oral traditions speak of a different people living in the ground in the place where Harwick Primary now stands are still present in the region. They have been present throughout the period when this investigation has been unfolding. They have watched with a mixture of interest and frustration that will be familiar to anyone who has studied the history of relationships between Australian Aboriginal communities and the institutions of Australian science and government, as the question of what their own traditions know about this place has been debated by people who do not always think to ask them directly. When Dr. Whitfield began her work, one of the first things she did was reach out to the relevant community organizations and begin a process of consultation that was slower and more complex and ultimately more rewarding than any of the purely archival or physical dimensions of the research. What she was told over the course of those consultations was not a simple or uniform thing. The communities in question are not monolithic, and their traditions are not a single document that can be read and summarized. But what emerged from those conversations, carefully and with appropriate respect for the conditions under which they were shared, was a consistent thread that connected to everything else in the investigation. The place had been known for a very long time as a place where something from before existed in the ground. The word used in the language of one of the communities involved was not a word that translated simply into English, but its closest approximation, offered by an elder who had thought carefully about how to convey it, was something like the place where the old world is still shut in. Not preserved, not buried, shut in, as though whatever was down there had been deliberately sealed away, not lost but contained, not forgotten but deliberately not disturbed. This understanding that the seal on the door was not simply a construction technique but was itself a message, a statement of intention by whoever had placed it there, is one that Dr. Whitfield has found the most difficult to convey to colleagues who are accustomed to thinking about archaeological features in purely material terms. The door was not simply closed. It was closed on purpose by people who understood what they were doing. And the communities who have lived on that land ever since have understood at some level that it was meant to stay closed. Whether it should stay closed is a different question. Whether the imperative that keeps it closed is a cultural one, a practical one, or something else entirely, is a question that the investigation has not yet answered. Whether the answers to all the other questions about the antechamber, who built it, when precisely, from where they came, what the room behind the door contains, whether those answers matter enough to justify the process of opening what was deliberately sealed, is a question that requires more than archaeology to resolve. It requires a conversation that is still in 2024 in its early stages. But the antechamber is still there, and it is older than Australia. And two boys found it in 1961 and knew at 11 years old that it was something they did not have words for. And one of them spent the rest of his life drawing a pattern he half remembered from the walls of a room he had spent maybe 12 minutes in and never quite got it right, and died wanting to get it right. And the other spent the rest of his life trying not to think about it too much, and mostly succeeded and died at peace with not having understood it. The door is still shut, the seal is still intact. The sandstone of the New South Wales landscape holds it quietly, in the dark, as it has held it for somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 years. and the school above it teaches children who do not know they are sitting on top of something that should not be there, something that was put there by people whose names we do not know, in a time before any of the histories we have written, in a world that was already old when the first European ship sailed into Botany Bay, and a man on the deck decided he knew what kind of country he was looking at. He did not know. He could not have known. None of us have known fully, and most of us still do not. The continent held its own history in its own way, in places that were not always visible to the people who arrived and looked around and thought they understood what they were seeing. Some of that history was written in rock art that would take centuries to begin to interpret. Some of it was carried in oral traditions that would take even longer to begin to listen to properly. And some of it was sealed behind a door in the bedrock beneath a school, waiting for two boys with a torch and a willingness to go where they were not supposed to go. They went, they saw, they were silent for 17 years. And then the stories began to surface piece by piece over the following half century through a network of people who were each, in their own way, unwilling to file the thing away in the category of things that had happened but could not be explained, who insisted instead on staying in the discomfort of not knowing, on treating the not knowing as a beginning rather than an ending, on refusing to let the sealed door simply remain sealed in the official account of what Australia is and was and has always been. That refusal is not finished. The work is not finished. The door is not open. But the question is alive. And questions that are alive, even when they are uncomfortable and inconvenient and structurally threatening to the stories we have told ourselves for generations, have a way of persisting. They accumulate evidence. They find their people. They wait. They are very good at waiting. In the years following Dr. Ashwood's 1997 paper, a researcher named Dr. James Carver, working independently and at first without any knowledge of the Harwick primary investigation, had been pursuing a parallel thread from an entirely different starting point. Carver was a historical linguist, not an archaeologist, and his interests were in the anomalies that existed in the early documentary record of Aboriginal Australian languages, specifically in the records made by European missionaries and administrators in the first decades of the 19th century, before the sustained contact of the colonial period had significantly altered the linguistic landscape of the communities being recorded. What he had found, working through a large body of archival material held at various institutions in Sydney, Melbourne, and London, was a set of loan words in several southeastern Australian Aboriginal languages that did not have identifiable sources within the Aboriginal language families of the region. Loanwords are common in all languages. They arrive through contact, through trade, through cultural exchange. When you find a loanword, you are finding evidence of a connection between the community that borrowed the word and the community from which it was borrowed. When you find loanwords that do not trace to any known source, you are finding evidence of a connection with a community that is no longer visible in the historical record. The loan words Carver had identified were a small set, perhaps a dozen, distributed across 3 language groups in the southeastern region. They shared certain phonological characteristics that suggested they had all come from the same source language, or from closely related varieties of the same language. The characteristics of that source language, as he was able to reconstruct them from the loanwords alone, were not consistent with any documented Aboriginal Australian language. They were not consistent with any of the neighbouring Southeast Asian languages he checked against. They were, in their reconstructed form, most closely consistent with a family of languages from the coastal regions of the Indian subcontinent, specifically the Dravidian language family, of which Tamil is the most widely spoken contemporary representative. He published this finding in a small historical linguistics journal in 1999, and it was not widely noticed. It was noticed by Dr. Ashwood, who wrote to him, and by a small number of others who were paying attention to the same set of questions from different angles. It was also noticed by a Tamil scholar based in Chennai, a woman named Dr. Priya Rajendran, who had been working for many years on questions of early Tamil maritime history and who had developed a particular interest in the evidence for Tamil seafaring activity in the Indian Ocean and beyond during the period of classical Tamil civilization, roughly the first millennium BCE and the first millennium CE. Dr. Rajendran was aware of the arguments, long circulating in both popular and academic Tamil discourse, that Tamil mariners had reached the coasts of Australia in antiquity. These arguments had been treated with varying degrees of seriousness by the Australian scholarly community, ranging from genuine engagement to active dismissal. The dismissal often took a form that combined methodological skepticism with a kind of territorial instinct about whose past the pre-colonial history of Australia was understood to be, which is a complicated dynamic that anyone familiar with the politics of archaeological research in post-colonial settings will recognize. Her particular contribution to the debate was not a grand claim about Tamil settlement in Australia. It was something more specific and more technical. She had been studying the distribution of a particular type of maritime trade good, a category of high-value craft object associated with the Tamil trading networks of the early Common Era, and she had documented its presence in the form of fragments and partial examples at a series of sites along the northern and western coasts of Australia, sites that had been excavated and reported over the previous several decades, but whose Tamil-associated objects had been categorized variously as recent intrusions, misidentified local materials, or simply anomalies requiring further investigation. Her paper, published in 2003 in collaboration with an Australian archaeologist named Dr. Ross Tanner, was a systematic review of those objects and the context in which they had been found. It argued carefully and with full acknowledgement of the limitations of the available evidence that the distribution pattern of Tamil-associated materials in the Australian coastal archaeological record was consistent with a sustained period of contact between Tamil maritime traders and coastal Aboriginal communities during the first millennium CE, possibly extending earlier. It did not claim that Tamil people had settled permanently in Australia or built permanent structures. It claimed contact, trade, exchange, the kind of relationship that leaves traces in the archaeological record and in the linguistic record and possibly in the oral traditions of the communities involved. When Dr. Ashwood read this paper and put it alongside Carver's linguistic findings and the genetic anomalies identified in the 2009 DNA study, and the oral tradition records mentioning a different people who had once lived in the ground in the region of Harwick Primary, she described the effect in a letter to Dr. Whitfield several years later as being like watching a photograph develop. Each piece of evidence was a partial image. Together, they were becoming something recognizable. The recognition she was approaching was not certainty. She was very clear about that, always. She was approaching a picture in which the antechamber at Harwick Primary was not an isolated anomaly, a single strange thing with no context, but rather a feature embedded in a much larger, much more complex, and much more interesting story about the human history of the Australian continent and its place in the maritime networks of the ancient Indo-Pacific world. A story in which Australia was not, as the official history had always implied, a place apart, separated from the great movements of human civilization by its geography until the Europeans arrived. A story in which Australia was connected, imperfectly and intermittently, and in ways that left traces we are still learning to read to the broader human world. This is a story that changes things, not the fundamental story of Aboriginal Australia, which has its own depth and complexity and does not need the addition of external contacts to be extraordinary, but the story of what Australia was in the context of the world's pre-modern history. The story of who visited and when and what they left behind and what they took with them and what exchange happened at the edges of those visits, in the communities that watched boats arrive and accepted trade goods and perhaps occasionally accepted something more. The antechamber is the most dramatic physical piece of that story because it is sealed and closed and inaccessible, and because its construction date puts it at the upper end of the timeline being considered, making it one of the oldest pieces of physical evidence for the presence of a non-Aboriginal, non-European people on the Australian continent. But it is not the only piece. It is the piece with the door, the piece that has not yet been opened, the piece that makes you stop wherever you are in the construction of this larger picture, and remember that there is something behind a sealed door in the bedrock of New South Wales that has not been looked at since it was sealed, and that nobody knows what it is. Dr. Whitfield knows what she hopes it is, and she is careful to keep hope and argument separate, which is the basic discipline of serious research. What she hopes is that behind the door, there is material evidence of the kind that would allow the Harwick primary site to function as a key that unlocks the broader question. Objects that can be identified, materials that can be dated, marks that can be read. A record of some kind that connects the people who built that room to a larger context that can be investigated and understood. What she expects, based on her knowledge of how sites like this tend to resolve when they are eventually opened, is something more ambiguous. Preservation is uncertain. 3,000 years is a long time, and the conditions in a sealed subterranean chamber can be very different from what the physical evidence suggests. She may open the door and find that whatever was there has degraded beyond the point of analysis. She may find it in remarkable condition. She may find something that raises more questions than it answers. She may find something that makes everything suddenly, surprisingly clear. She will not know until the door is open. The door is not open. The conversation about whether and how and under what conditions it should be opened is ongoing, and it is a conversation that involves more than academic institutions. It involves the communities on whose country the site stands. It involves the heritage authorities whose legal mandate covers the site. It involves the school itself and the school board, and the parents of children who attend a school that sits above a sealed antechamber in the bedrock, and all the complex institutional and political and cultural dynamics that attend any attempt to excavate a site in an active community setting. It is a slow process. It has always been a slow process, from the moment two boys slid through a gap in a wall and stood in front of a sealed door and felt the cold of it against their palms. Everything about this story has moved slowly, in the particular way that things move slowly when they are embedded in a reality that the available frameworks cannot accommodate. When the world is older than anyone has told you, the reckoning with that fact does not happen quickly. It happens over decades. It happens through the accumulation of threads held by different people in different disciplines who are each separately doing the work of taking the question seriously. The question is serious. The antechamber is real. The door is real. The seal around the door, applied by hands that are 3,000 years gone, is real. The radiocarbon date is real. The tool marks in the stone are real. The loan words in the languages of the region are real. The genetic anomalies in the ancient DNA are real. Barry's drawing of the pattern on the walls, none of which satisfied him, which he kept trying and kept abandoning and kept returning to until he died, is real. All of it is real. None of it is yet enough to open the door in the official account of what Australia's past contains. That opening's coming. It is slow and it is uncomfortable, and it is complicated by the full weight of everything that the official account has meant to the people who have inhabited it and the people who have been excluded from it. But it is coming. And when it comes, when the conversation has progressed far enough and the institutional frameworks have shifted far enough, and the community consultations have reached far enough toward a genuine consensus that the time has come, when someone finally stands in the antechamber under Harwick Primary with proper equipment and proper authority and proper respect for everything that the site carries, and reaches for the door, they will be the next person in a line of people stretching back to two 11-year-old boys on a July afternoon in 1961 who stood in the dark and understood, without having the language for it, that the world was older than anyone had told them. The world is older. The door is still shut. The question is alive. And questions that are alive, as this one has demonstrated over the course of more than 60 years, do not go away. They simply wait for the moment when the world is ready to hear what they have to say. That moment is not yet here, but it is closer than it was. It is always, slowly, closer than it was. The antechamber waits. The door waits. The seal, applied with care and intention 3,000 years ago by people who understood exactly what they were doing, holds. And somewhere under a school in New South Wales, in the dark and the silence of the bedrock, whatever lies behind that door waits too. Patient, sealed in, not forgotten but not yet reached, not yet. Rest now. The world is older than anyone told you, and it will still be here with all of its sealed rooms and its unanswered questions and its slow, stubborn refusal to be smaller than we want it to be when you wake up. It will still be here. There is a version of this story that begins not in 1961 but in 1843, when a surveyor named George Hallowell walked the Dry Creek country west of what would become Harwick Township and made notes in a leather-covered book that is now held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. Hallowell was not a literary man. His notes are functional, spare, oriented toward the practical purposes of land survey. They record distances and bearings and soil types and the presence or absence of water. They are not the kind of document you would expect to be interesting, but on the 14th page of his notebook, in a section covering the ground that would eventually become the school reserve, Halliwell wrote something that stands apart from everything else in the document. He wrote that the ground in this location had a peculiar quality, and that his party's two Aboriginal guides, men he refers to only as Jack and the Old One, became noticeably reluctant to proceed when they reached the area near the creek bed. He recorded, with the slightly impatient tone of a practical man dealing with what he understood as superstition, that Jack told him through the translated word of another man in the party that the place below the ground here was not empty, that there was something in it that had been there since before the memory of his people's memory. Halliwell did not ask what that meant. He noted it and moved on. This account, which Dr. Ashwood found in 1992 while working through colonial-era survey records for a different project, was one of the pieces of evidence she included in her 1997 paper. She included it knowing that a single line in a surveyor's notebook is not, by itself, evidence of anything beyond the fact that a surveyor once noted something he did not fully understand. But she included it because it was one more thread in the pattern she was trying to make visible. Because Halliwell had no reason to fabricate or embellish. He was not writing for an audience. He was writing notes for a survey report. The line about Jack's reluctance and the thing in the ground is not something he needed to put there. He put it there because it happened, and he recorded what happened, the old one. That is what Halliwell called the second guide, and the phrase is untranslated because Halliwell did not know the man's name or did not think it worth recording. The old one was presumably an elder of the community whose country this was. Elders in Aboriginal Australian societies are the keepers of country knowledge. They know what the land holds and what has happened on it and what the land means. When an elder becomes reluctant in a particular place and says that something has been in the ground there since before the memory of his people's memory, he is speaking from a body of knowledge that has been maintained through systems of cultural transmission, sophisticated enough to preserve accurate information across very long spans of time. Before the memory of his people's memory, that phrase filtered through 2 layers of translation and then recorded by a man who did not know what to make of it, is the most important thing in Halliwell's notebook. It is saying something specific about time. It is saying that the thing in the ground predates the oral historical memory of the community, that it belongs not to the period that living memory and living tradition can reach, but to the period before the deep past, the time before people currently alive can trace their traditions to. This is a meaningful distinction in cultures with sophisticated oral traditions. The boundary between what is remembered in the sense of being part of the living transmission and what is known in the deeper sense of having been carried forward in encoded forms, in story and lore and ceremony, is not a boundary that exists in the same way in cultures with written records. But it is real, and people who maintain oral traditions are usually quite precise about where a piece of knowledge sits relative to it. When the old one said before the memory of his people's memory, he was not using a vague phrase meaning a long time ago. He was making a statement about the depth of time involved. He was saying this is older than what we know in the sense of living transmission. We know it is there. We know it matters. We do not know, in the way that we know the things we carry actively, what it is. This is consistent with what the later community consultations, the ones Dr. Whitfield conducted from the early 2010s onward, revealed. The place was known. The knowledge of its existence and its significance had been carried forward. But the specific knowledge of what it was and who had made it had been lost or was held in forms that were not accessible in the context of those conversations. or had never existed, because the people who built the antechamber had not been part of the communities whose traditions had carried the knowledge of its existence forward. They had been visitors. The antechamber and the sealed door were what they left behind when they went away, and the communities who remained on that country knew the leaving without knowing the leavers. This is a human situation. It is recognizable. People pass through places and leave marks, and the people who live on those places ever after know the marks are there without necessarily knowing who made them or why. The marks become part of the landscape's meaning, part of what the place is, without necessarily being fully understood. What is unusual about the Harwick primary case is the scale of the mark. A sealed room in bedrock is not a scratching on a stone or a scatter of discarded tools. It is a significant construction, built by people who clearly intended it to endure, sealed by people who clearly intended it to remain sealed, in a material that has demonstrably endured the test of 3,000 years. Whoever made it meant to make something permanent. The question of why is one that the investigation has circled without yet being able to answer. Sealed rooms in ancient contexts can mean many things. They can be tombs built to house the dead and the goods that accompany the dead. They can be sanctuaries built to protect something considered sacred from the conditions of the outside world. They can be storage, built to preserve materials of practical value for later retrieval by people who expected to return. They can be records, built to hold information in a form intended to survive conditions that would destroy other forms of preservation. There is no consensus among the researchers who have engaged with the Harwick primary evidence about which of these categories the antechamber most likely represents. The fact that the door was sealed rather than simply closed suggests that whoever made it intended the contents to remain undisturbed for a period of time they understood would be long. The care evident in the application of the seal suggests that the people who made it understood what they were doing and were confident in the longevity of their material, which means they had experience with it, which means it was not improvised or experimental. It was a known technique applied by people who had applied it before. This in turn suggests an organization of knowledge and practice of a kind that is not consistent with a single small group of travelers who happened upon the Australian coast by accident. The people who built the antechamber knew how to build it. They had the tools, which were themselves sophisticated and non-local. They had the sealing compound, which was also non-local and which required processing that implies knowledge of chemistry and of the specific plant from which it was derived. They had the skill to work stone in the way the tool marks in the antechamber walls show it was worked. These are not the skills of people who were improvising. These are the skills of people who came prepared for a specific task. The question of why a group of people who came prepared for a specific task would travel to the southeastern coast of the Australian continent 3,000 years ago is one that requires knowing more about the world of 3,000 years ago than most people in the modern era typically consider. 3,000 years before the present is approximately the year 1000 BCE, which is a period of considerable maritime activity across the Indo-Pacific region. The Bronze Age civilizations of South and Southeast Asia were at or near their peak. The trading networks of the ancient world connected the Persian Gulf to the coasts of India, to the ports of Southeast Asia, to the edges of the Pacific. Ships capable of ocean voyages were being built and sailed by peoples whose names are mostly forgotten and whose records are mostly lost. The Tamil civilization of southern India was already ancient by this point. The Dravidian linguistic and cultural tradition from which Tamil emerges has roots that extend to at least the 3rd millennium BCE, when the Indus Valley civilization, which spoke a language or languages likely related to the Dravidian family, was at its height. By 1000 BCE, the coastal communities of southern India were already engaged in maritime trade that reached into Southeast Asia. They had the ships, they had the navigational knowledge, they had the trade goods and the organizational capacity to mount expeditions across significant ocean distances. The Indian Ocean is not as forbidding as it looks on a map if you know the monsoon system. The monsoon winds that blow across the Indian Ocean in a regular seasonal pattern, reversing direction twice a year with a reliability that ancient mariners learned to exploit, made the ocean crossable in ways that the Pacific, which does not have an equivalent regular wind system, was not until the Polynesians developed the navigational techniques to work with its more variable conditions. A ship departing from the southeastern coast of India in the season of the southwest monsoon could, following the wind, reach the coasts of Southeast Asia and beyond. In the season of the northeast monsoon, the wind blew the other way and ships could return. Beyond Southeast Asia, the winds are more complex and the distances are greater, but they are not impossibly greater. The chain of islands that constitutes modern Indonesia creates a navigational corridor, a series of stepping stones that connects the Indian Ocean maritime world to the waters north and west of Australia. A vessel following that corridor with knowledge of the currents and the seasonal patterns could reach the northern coast of Australia. From the northern coast, following the coast southward and then eastward along the continent's arc, is a long journey but not an impossible one, particularly for people who were already capable of the initial ocean crossing. This is the pathway that Dr. Rajendran's research on Tamil maritime history suggests was navigated, probably not once but repeatedly, over a period of several centuries during the early 1st millennium BCE and the early 1st millennium CE. Her evidence for this is the distribution of material culture, the specific trade goods and craft objects and linguistic traces that she and her collaborators have documented. It does not yet include the Harwick primary antechamber because the antechamber predates the period she has most fully documented, and because the connection, while plausible, has not been established with the specificity that would allow it to be incorporated into her published argument. But the possibility is there, the pathway is there, the capability is there. And the date is consistent. 3,000 years ago, the maritime world that could have produced the builders of the Harwick primary antechamber was active and capable. The question is not whether they could have made that journey. The question is why they would have, and why, having made it, they would have built a sealed room in the bedrock of the southeastern Australian landscape and then apparently left without returning, or at least without returning in a way that left a documentary trace. One answer that has been proposed tentatively and with full acknowledgement of its speculative nature has to do with what the region around Harwick may have held in the geological past that it does not visibly hold now. The creek bed that runs beside the school has been dry for much of the recorded history of the area, but it has not always been dry. In the early Holocene, the period between roughly 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, the climate of southeastern Australia was wetter than it is now, and the waterways of the region were more active. The creek bed beside Harwick Primary was, in the period when the antechamber was built, probably a living creek, possibly a significant one. Where there is permanent water in a dry landscape, there is also often mineral wealth. Gold, in particular, has a habit of concentrating in the alluvial deposits of ancient creek systems. The gold fields of New South Wales, which the European settlers of the 19th century discovered and exploited, follow the courses of ancient waterways. The gold fields were not created by the European settlers, they were found by them. The gold was already there, concentrated by geological processes over millions of years. And the ancient creek that ran beside what is now Harwick Primary, if it was active and significant in the period around 1000 BCE, may have been associated with alluvial gold deposits that a party of experienced maritime traders and prospectors, people who knew what to look for and had the knowledge of materials to recognize it, might have found worth a very long journey. This is speculation. It should be clearly understood as speculation. There is no evidence that gold was found in the vicinity of Harwick Primary by pre-colonial visitors, because there is no accessible evidence from the site itself. And the European gold discoveries in the region, while real, were not concentrated in the immediate area of the school. But the speculation has the quality of fitting the pattern in the way that good speculation fits the pattern of available evidence without claiming more than the evidence supports. People who traveled very far by sea and then by land to build a sealed room in bedrock were not doing it for nothing. They were doing it for something. A sealed room in bedrock is a serious investment of time and skill and material. Whatever it contains or whatever it was built to protect or preserve was worth that investment to the people who made it. And they sealed it with something they brought with them because the sealing compound is not native to the region. They carried their sealing material from somewhere else, across however many thousands of kilometers separated their origin point from the site where they used it. This is not the behavior of people who arrived accidentally. This is the behavior of people who came with a specific plan and executed it. The plan was thorough enough that the seal has held for 3,000 years. Whatever they were sealing in or sealing against was understood by them to require that kind of permanence. And then they went away and they did not come back, or if they did come back, it was in a different form and under different circumstances, and they left no trace of the return, and the door has been shut ever since. Through the slow drying of the climate and the dying of the creek and the arrival of the Europeans and the establishment of the town and the building of the school and the collapse of the wall and the two boys and the engineer and the concrete and all the years since. Through all of that, the seal has held. There is something in that persistence that resists easy categorization as either triumphant or tragic. The people who made the seal succeeded. Whatever they intended to preserve has been preserved, at least in the sense of remaining sealed away from the processes that degrade most things across 3 millennia. But the purpose of that preservation is unknown. Whether anyone will ever know what it was is uncertain. Whether the door will ever be opened and the answer, whatever form it takes, encountered, is a question that belongs to the future rather than the present. What belongs to the present is the slow, difficult, necessary work of taking the question seriously, of treating the evidence that exists, incomplete and contested as it is, with the rigor and the respect it deserves, of conducting the community consultations and the institutional negotiations and the political arguments that must precede any formal archaeological intervention at the site, of being honest about what is known and what is not known and what the gap between those two things means, and of understanding that the story of the antechamber under Harwick Primary is not an isolated curiosity. It is a window into a larger story about the human past that the official frameworks of Australian and world history have not yet fully incorporated. A story about the connectivity of the ancient world, about the reach of maritime civilization before the era of European expansion, about the complexity of the human presence on the Australian continent across deep time, and about the ways in which the evidence for all of this has been overlooked, filed away, buried under concrete, or simply not yet found. There are almost certainly other sites, other sealed rooms, other anomalous features, other places where the physical record of the deep past breaks through the surface of the official narrative and demands attention. Australia is a large continent with a complex geological history and a human history in the form of Aboriginal occupation that extends back at least 65,000 years. In 65,000 years of human presence in a continent as geologically varied and as locationally significant for transoceanic navigation as Australia, the likelihood that the Harwick primary antechamber is unique is low. What is more likely is that it is the most fully documented of a class of features whose full extent is not yet known because the research traditions and the funding structures and the institutional frameworks that would allow systematic investigation of that class of features have not yet been fully developed. Dr. Whitfield has made this argument in more careful terms in several of her recent papers. She is building a case not just for the reopening of the Harwick primary site, but for a broader program of research into pre-colonial contact with Australia, one that would bring together the genetic evidence and the linguistic evidence and the material culture evidence and the oral tradition evidence in a coordinated framework that could generate testable hypotheses and systematic investigation. She's not there yet. The institutional and funding landscape for this kind of work is challenging. The political dimensions are complex. The community consultation requirements are both legally necessary and ethically right, and they take time. But she is working, and she is not working alone. The network of researchers who have been drawn into this investigation from across disciplines and across countries is larger now than it has ever been. The questions that Dr. Ashwood first put into print in 1988 have had 35 years to accumulate the people who take them seriously. That is how science actually works in the long run, not in moments of sudden revelation, but in the slow accumulation of seriousness, of people who are willing to spend their careers on questions that the mainstream considers uncomfortable, building the evidentiary base that eventually forces the mainstream to engage. Barry drew his pattern 1,000 times and never got it right, but he kept drawing it. He kept trying. He did not give up on the reality of what he had seen just because no one around him had a framework for it. He held the knowledge in himself, imperfectly, for decades, and then he gave it to someone who could do something with it. That is what witnesses do when they are witnesses to things that are not yet understood. They hold the knowledge. They pass it on. They trust that someone eventually will know what to do with it. The world is older than anyone told him. The world is older than anyone has told most of us. The sealed door in the bedrock is one way the older world announces itself, in the specific way that sealed rooms announce themselves. which is by being there when you are not expecting them, by being impossible to fit into the available story, by being cold in a way that seems excessive, and by making you stand in front of them for a long time without knowing exactly why. Barry stood there for 12 minutes and spent 78 years thinking about it. Thomas stood there for 12 minutes and spent 65 years almost not thinking about it. And the almost is important because it was always there under the not thinking about it. Quietly present in the way that things are present when they are real and when they have lodged themselves somewhere that cannot be cleared out by the simple decision to move on. The door was real, the seal was real, the cold was real, the room was real, and whatever lies behind the door in the dark and the silence that is held for 3,000 years is real too. We do not know what it is. We know it is there. We know that the people who put it there knew what they were doing. We know that the land on which it sits has carried the knowledge of its existence through the oral traditions of the communities whose country this is, across the full span of time since it was made. We know that the evidence for the broader context in which it was made, the maritime connections, the transoceanic reach of ancient civilizations, the complexity of the human past in and around Australia, is accumulating. We know that the conversation about what to do with it is ongoing and that the people who need to be part of that conversation are increasingly part of it. And we know that the door is still shut, that the seal is still intact, that the patient, particular, very old darkness behind the door has not yet been disturbed, that we are still, all of us who have been drawn into this story by one path or another, standing outside a sealed door with our hands against the cold of it, knowing that opening it will change things and not yet knowing in which direction the change will run. That is where we are. That is where the story is. Not at the resolution, but at the threshold. Not past the door, but in front of it. In the particular, specific discomfort of knowing that there is something behind the door and not knowing what it is, and knowing that the not knowing is not going to be resolved quickly or easily or without the full weight of everything that a question this old and this significant and this structurally inconvenient carries with it. The discomfort is appropriate. The discomfort is, in its way, the right response. Because the alternative to the discomfort is the filing away, the categorizing of the inexplicable as simply inexplicable and moving on, which is what has happened repeatedly in this story and which has cost, each time it has happened, another increment of the understanding that could have been accumulating all along. The two boys were silent for 17 years. Dr. Ashwood hesitated for 9 years before publishing. The council sealed the antechamber in concrete. All of these were forms of filing away, responses to the discomfort of the inexplicable that chose avoidance over engagement. The opposite of that choice is what the researchers who have stayed with this question over decades have been practicing. Staying with the discomfort, staying in front of the door, continuing to ask what it is and who put it there and what it means, even when the asking is professionally uncomfortable and institutionally unrewarding and epistemologically uncertain. Staying and working and waiting for the moment when the conversation has progressed far enough that the door can finally be approached with the full set of tools that a question of this depth and importance requires. That moment is not here, but it is coming, slowly, as everything in this story has moved slowly, but it is coming. And when it comes, the people who open the door will owe a debt to everyone who kept the question alive, in the years when it would have been easier to let it die. To the engineer who photographed an antechamber in 98 because he photographed everything and put his photographs in his files, and eventually, through a chain of connections he had not intended, in the hands of someone who knew what to do with them. To the linguist who worked through archival records for a different project and noticed something that did not fit and wrote it down. To the geneticists who included an anomalous finding in a paper about something else and noted it with the appropriate care and honesty. To the elder who told the early missionary that there were people before and whose words were written down imperfectly but were written down. To Barry, who drew the pattern again and again and never got it right but never stopped trying to get it right. To Thomas, who said some things are not meant to be understood by the people who find them, and who was probably right that they were not the people meant to understand it, but who was also part of the chain that led to the people who might be. To the children who attend Harwick Primary today and who have no idea what is under their feet, who are busy with their own lives and their own discoveries and their own particular specific experience of being alive in a world that is older than anyone has told them. They will not all spend their lives thinking about it. Most of them will not. But somewhere among them, perhaps, is someone who will one day learn that their school was built above a sealed antechamber in bedrock that predates the European settlement of Australia by more than 3,000 years, and who will feel, in response to that knowledge, the particular pull that some people feel toward questions that are larger than the available answers. The pull that has drawn researchers and witnesses and elders and children through this story for more than 60 years. And they will follow that pull, and they will add their piece to the accumulation, and the door will be a little closer to opening than it was before. The world is older than anyone told you. There is a door in the bedrock. It has been shut for 3,000 years. What is behind it is waiting. It is worth considering at this point what it means to find a door you cannot open, not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the very specific material sense that applies to the antechamber beneath Harwick Primary. A door you cannot open is not a dead end. It is a form of information. Everything about it, the material it is made from, the method of its sealing, the care that went into its construction, the orientation in which it was set into its frame, tells you something about the people who made it. They are speaking to you across 3,000 years through the medium of their craftsmanship. The door is a document. It has not yet been fully read. Dr. Okafor spent the later part of his career thinking about this. He had been trained as a geologist with a secondary training in forensic materials analysis, and his approach to the antechamber was always primarily material. He wanted to know what things were made of and how, because the how of construction tells you things about the who and the when that other kinds of evidence cannot reach as precisely. He spent years working with the photographic record, developing and refining the analytical techniques that eventually allowed him to characterize the tool marks with the specificity that went into his 2001 paper with Dr. Ashwood. But in his later work, which was less published and more personal, he moved toward questions that the material analysis could not fully answer on its own. He became interested in what the construction of the antechamber implied about the builder's understanding of time, not time in the abstract, but operational time. The time they anticipated the seal would need to last. The time they expected to elapse before whatever they sealed in would next be accessed, if it was intended to be accessed at all. This is an unusual framework to bring to archaeological analysis, but it is not an illegitimate one. When you seal something, you make an implicit estimate of the duration your seal needs to hold. A seal that is designed to last a week is different from a seal that is designed to last a century, which is different from a seal that is designed to last indefinitely. The materials you choose, the thickness of application, the care taken in the surface preparation of the substrate, all of these decisions encode information about the time frame you're working within. The seal at Harwick Primary, as Okafor analyzed it from the photographic record and from the small sample Ashwood had taken in 1978, was not a casual application. It was thick, it was layered, it was applied with attention to every joint and edge, and the material itself, the processed plant resin of unknown precise origin, was chosen for its longevity. Okafor could not say with certainty that the builders had intended the seal to last 3,000 years specifically. He could say that they had intended it to last a very long time, long enough that the material and the method were chosen with permanence as a primary criterion. This implies a cultural relationship with time that is worth considering. A culture that builds things to last 3,000 years is a culture that thinks about the future in a specific way. It is a culture that understands deep time, not just conceptually but practically, in the sense of making material decisions based on a projected future that extends well beyond the lifespan of the individuals doing the building. This is a form of institutional or cultural continuity that requires sustained investment across generations. The kind of continuity that is associated with complex societies, with civilizational scale organization, with the kind of cultural infrastructure that maintains knowledge and purpose across the depths of individual knowledge holders. The people who built the antechamber at Harwick Primary were not, in other words, building something for themselves. They were building something for a future that they would not personally inhabit, or at least that they did not expect to inhabit in the same form as the one in which they were building. They were building for a return that they may have intended to make, or may have expected their successors to make. Or they were building something they intended to remain sealed indefinitely, as a form of preservation that was not about access, but about the simple fact of what it preserved persisting. Either way, the scale of the investment and the quality of the execution speak to a civilization that understood itself as something larger than any individual life or any individual journey. That is not a small thing to say about a group of people who were, apparently, a very long way from home. The question of where home was remains contested. Dr. Rajendran's argument for a South Indian connection is the most developed and the best supported by independent lines of evidence, but it is not the only argument that has been made. Over the years, the antechamber has attracted the attention of researchers working from a range of starting points, some of them more rigorously grounded than others. There have been proposed connections to the Phoenician maritime world, to the ancient Egyptian trading networks, to the civilization of the Indus Valley, to various interpretations of pre-Columbian contact traditions. Most of these proposals have not moved beyond the speculative stage because they are not supported by the kind of converging independent evidence that the South Indian hypothesis has accumulated. The Phoenician connection in particular has been a recurring feature of the popular discourse around Australian archaeological anomalies for several decades, drawing on a broader tradition of Phoenician contact claims that extends to sites in the Americas and elsewhere. The evidence for Phoenician presence in Australia is assessed fairly thin. There are claimed inscriptions in various locations that some researchers have read as Phoenician script, but none of these claims have survived rigorous independent verification. The Harwick primary antechamber does not have an obvious connection to the Phoenician maritime world, either in the dating, which is earlier than the period of maximum Phoenician maritime activity, or in the construction characteristics, which do not match what is known of Phoenician building techniques. The Indus Valley hypothesis is more interesting, partly because the Indus Valley civilization was contemporary with the earliest end of the date range for the Harwick primary seal, and partly because the Dravidian linguistic connection that Carver identified in the southeastern Australian loanwords could be read as pointing toward Indus Valley origins, since the Indus Valley civilization is hypothesized by a number of scholars to have been a Dravidian-speaking civilization. But the Indus Valley civilization collapsed around 1900 BCE, which is earlier than the most probable date for the antechamber's construction, and the connection remains indirect. The South Indian hypothesis, grounded in the Tamil maritime tradition, remains the most coherent and best supported framework for understanding who might have built the antechamber. It is not a proven case. The direct evidence connecting the antechamber to specific Tamil or Proto-Tamil seafarers is not yet available because the antechamber has not been properly excavated. If and when it is, and if the contents are preserved well enough to analyze, the question of origin may become considerably more tractable. What would constitute convincing evidence of South Indian origin if found behind the door? Objects characteristic of the material culture of the early first millennium BCE Indian subcontinent, such as specific types of pottery or metalwork, would be very significant. Inscriptions in a Dravidian language or script would be extraordinary, though script in the Dravidian tradition of that period is not well attested, and the identification would be difficult. The processed plant resin of the seal itself, more fully analyzed from a fresh sample rather than the deteriorated material Ashwood took in 1978, might allow identification of the plant species used and therefore its geographic origin, which could be highly informative. And any biological material, plant remains, food residue, organic artifacts, if preserved, could provide both carbon dates and isotopic signatures that might allow geographic sourcing. None of this is available until the door is open, and the door is not open. So the investigation remains where it has been for most of its history, in the space before the answer, in the accumulation of context and evidence and argument that is building toward the eventual opening of the question in its full complexity. The geological context of the site has received increasing attention in recent years, partly as a result of the interest in Aboriginal stone arrangement sites that has developed in Australian archaeology over the past decade. Stone arrangement sites, places where rock has been moved and arranged in patterns by human hands, are found across the Australian continent and represent a form of cultural landscape modification that has been underappreciated in the archaeological record. The dating of stone arrangements is technically difficult because the arrangements themselves are not always directly datable, but associated organic material and stratigraphy have allowed some arrangements to be placed at considerable age, with some examples dating to several thousand years before present. The antechamber at Harwick Primary is not a stone arrangement site in the conventional sense because it is subterranean rather than surface level, and because the construction technique is distinct from what is documented in the stone arrangement literature. But it shares with those sites the quality of being a deliberate human modification of a rocky landscape made with purpose and skill that has been overlooked or misinterpreted by the dominant frameworks of Australian archaeological interpretation. The renewed attention to stone arrangements has created a slightly more receptive institutional environment for the kind of argument that Whitfield, Ashwood, and Okafor have been making about the antechamber, because it has widened the acknowledged range of significant pre-colonial archaeological features in the Australian landscape and made the field slightly less resistant to the idea that there is more there than has yet been understood. The resistance, where it persists, tends now to take a different form than it did in 1988 or even 1997. The early dismissal of Ashwood's work was, in some cases, a dismissal of the fundamental claim that there could be pre-colonial archaeological features in Australia of the kind she was describing. That dismissal is harder to sustain now, given the accumulation of evidence from multiple independent directions. The resistance that remains is more often a methodological one, a legitimate argument about the strength of the evidence and the appropriateness of the conclusions being drawn from it. This is better resistance in the sense that it engages with the substance rather than refusing to engage at all, and it is the kind of resistance that can be answered by the generation of better evidence, which is what the ongoing research program is attempting to do. Dr. Whitfield has spent the last several years building the institutional and community relationships that she believes need to be in place before any formal application for excavation of the Harwick primary site can be made. This is slow and sometimes frustrating work, but she is clear-eyed about its necessity. The site sits in a complex jurisdictional space involving heritage law at both the state and federal level, the native title framework that governs the relationship between Australian law and Aboriginal community rights over country, and the practical considerations of a site that is currently actively used as a school. Any excavation would require approvals from multiple authorities, the genuine consent of the relevant Aboriginal communities, and a negotiated arrangement with the school that would allow the work to proceed without causing unacceptable disruption to the children and staff. The native title dimension is particularly important, and it is the dimension that has received the most attention in the community consultations. Native title law in Australia recognises the ongoing connection of Aboriginal peoples to their traditional country and provides legal mechanisms for that connection to be acknowledged in decisions about the use of that country. The Harwick primary site sits within the country of a specific Aboriginal community whose traditional ownership of the area was recognised through native title proceedings in 2008. That community has a legal right to be consulted about archaeological work on the site, and their free, prior, and informed consent is required for certain types of intervention. The consultations that Dr. Whitfield has conducted with that community have been genuine and respectful, and they have produced a relationship of trust that did not exist at the beginning of the process. The community's position on the antechamber is nuanced and has evolved through the consultations. They know what it is, in the sense of knowing it exists and knowing it is significant. They have the oral tradition knowledge that has carried that significance forward. They also have perspectives and concerns about any intervention at the site that are different from and not reducible to the perspectives and concerns of the researchers. Some members of the community are supportive of excavation on the grounds that understanding what is there more fully could contribute to a more complete account of the deep history of their country, an account that would honor rather than diminish the full complexity of what that history has been. Others are more cautious for reasons that include but go beyond the standard heritage preservation concern about disturbing ancient sites. The specific caution that some elders have expressed about the antechamber connects to the tradition that it was sealed deliberately, that the sealing was intentional, and the intention was that it should remain sealed, and that there may be reasons for that intention that are not fully understood from the outside. This is a form of caution that deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed as superstition or cultural sensitivity, but engaged with as a real claim about the nature of the site. The people who sealed the antechamber knew what they were sealing in. They presumably had reasons for sealing it that went beyond simply protecting it from the elements. The communities whose country the site sits on have carried a knowledge across 3,000 years that the place below the ground was not to be disturbed. The convergence of those two facts, the deliberate sealing and the traditional knowledge of its significance, suggests that there may be something about the site that justifies more than ordinary caution. What that something might be, Dr. Whitfield does not claim to know. She takes the caution seriously because the people who have expressed it take it seriously, and because the full context of the site, including the context she does not yet have access to, has not yet been established. Her approach has been to proceed carefully and consultatively, not to push for an excavation timeline that prioritizes her research interests over the legitimate concerns of the community, but also not to step back from the investigation entirely. The work of building understanding, even without the physical opening of the site, is valuable and is ongoing. In the meantime, the site itself continues to be monitored. The concrete that was poured over the antechamber in 1987 is now nearly 40 years old, and concrete does not last forever. A structural assessment of the current school building conducted in 2019 noted that the subsurface conditions beneath the building are complex and that there is evidence of void space at a depth consistent with the antechamber's known dimensions. The school board was informed. The Nesodla Heritage Office was informed. The relevant Aboriginal community organisation was informed. All three are now part of a monitoring group that meets annually to review the condition of the site and the status of the heritage assessment. It is a slow process. It has always been a slow process, and there is no reason to expect it to speed up dramatically in the near term. But it is a process that is at least happening with the appropriate parties at the table in a way that was not the case in 1987 when the concrete was poured. That is progress. It is not the kind of progress that makes headlines or produces dramatic revelations. It is the kind of progress that consists of the gradual creation of the conditions under which a dramatic revelation might eventually be possible in the right way, with the right permissions, with the right people involved, with the right understanding of what is at stake. The sealed door waits. The patience it has already demonstrated across 30 centuries is not in danger of being exhausted by the additional few years that the consultative process requires. It has waited this long. It will wait a little longer. There is a photograph taken by Robert Canfield in 1978 that Dr. Whitfield has printed and kept on the wall of her office at the University of Sydney. It is a black and white photograph of the door itself, taken from roughly 2 meters away, with a torch angle that illuminates the face of the door and the upper portion of the seal around it. The photograph is not high resolution by modern standards. The detail is imperfect, but you can see in the surface of the door something that is difficult to categorize on first viewing. a quality of the material that is neither purely reflective nor purely absorptive. The surface of the door does something to the light that falls on it that is slightly unexpected, in a way that is hard to articulate and that Whitfield has described, when people ask her about it, as the thing that makes the photograph hard to look away from. Canfield did not know what the door was made of, neither did Ashwood, neither does Whitfield. The photographic analysis that has been applied to the image does not resolve the question. The material appears to be neither a common stone nor metal in any form that has been identified. It has a texture and a light response that do not match any reference material in the databases that Okafor used in his analysis. This is not a conclusion, because the photographic record is an indirect form of evidence and a material cannot be definitively identified from photographs alone. But it is an anomaly, one more anomaly added to the list. The door is made of something that has not been identified. It was sealed with a processed plant resin that is not native to the region in which it was found. It was constructed in a room carved by tools of a type not documented in the Australian archaeological record. The room was known to Aboriginal communities as a place of ancient significance, understood to contain something from before the memory of their people's memory. The date of the seal's application predates the European settlement of Australia by more than 3,000 years. The loan words in nearby Aboriginal languages point toward a South Indian linguistic connection. The genetic anomalies in ancient Australian DNA point toward a South Asian population contact. The material culture distribution research points toward Tamil maritime presence in northern Australia during the relevant period. None of these threads is conclusive on its own. Together they form a picture. The picture is incomplete and its outlines are contested, but it is a picture of something real, something that happened. People who came from far away, who built something permanent in the bedrock of a continent they were visiting, who sealed what they built with care and intention, who went away and did not return in any form that the record has captured, and a door that is still shut, and a question that is still alive, and a slow, patient, necessary process of bringing the full weight of contemporary knowledge, contemporary technique, contemporary relationships, and contemporary ethical frameworks to bear on the question of what is behind the door and what it means. That process is the story. Not the discovery in 1961, not the radiocarbon date in 1979, not the concrete in 1987, not the paper in 1988 or 1997 or 2001, not any of the individual moments along the way, but the whole long movement of it, from two boys with a torch to a researcher with a photograph on her office wall, from a dry creek in 1843 to a heritage monitoring group that meets annually, from an elder who could not be translated adequately by a colonial-era administrator to a community consultation that is finding its own language for what it knows. That is the story, incomplete, ongoing, full of things that are not yet resolved, but alive, stubbornly, persistently, productively alive. The world is older than anyone told you. The door is still shut. The question is still alive. And you, lying here in the dark, listening to this, are now part of the chain of people who know about it. You know about the antechamber. You know about Thomas and Barry and Robert Canfield and Margaret Ashwood and Francis Okafor and Priya Rajendran and James Carver and Claire Whitfield. You know about the seal and the tool marks and the loan words and the DNA and the oral traditions, and the photograph on the office wall and the monitoring group that meets annually and the door that is still shut. You are now a person who knows this. That is something. Not a large something, but not nothing. The story survives by being known by people, and you know it now, and you will carry it somewhere in your mind, in the particular way that things like this are carried, not always in the foreground, not always actively remembered, but there, lodged somewhere in the category that Barry used and Thomas used. The category of things that happened and that cannot be explained and that therefore never quite leave you. You will probably think about the door at some point in the next few days in an unguarded moment, and you will wonder what is behind it, and you will not know, and you will file the wondering away, and it will come back. That is what this kind of thing does. It comes back. It comes back because it is real, and because real things that are not resolved have a persistent quality that the mind cannot fully let go of. That persistence is not nothing. That is how questions survive. That is how they accumulate the people who work on them. That is how, eventually, after long enough, and with enough accumulated work, and enough accumulated understanding, and enough accumulated trust, and enough accumulated courage, doors get opened. Rest well. The world is very old, and it will still be here, with all of its sealed rooms and its unanswered questions, and its stubborn refusal to be smaller than the stories we have told about it in the morning when you wake up. It will still be here. There is a discipline in archaeology called landscape biography, and it attempts to understand a place not as a static location, but as something that has accumulated meaning over time, layer by layer, the way a tree accumulates rings, each one invisible from the outside but present in the total thickness of the thing. A landscape biography of the area around Harwick Primary School would be a remarkable document if it could be written fully. It would have to begin at the deepest readable layer with the geological formation of the sandstone itself, which was laid down as sediment in a shallow sea that covered the region several 100 million years ago. The sea retreated, the sediment lithified. The land was shaped by the forces that shape land over those spans of time, by uplift and erosion and the cutting of the creek that eventually became the dry creek bed beside the school. Then, at some point, human beings arrived. The date of the first human presence in the area around Harwick is not precisely established, but it is consistent with the general pattern of human movement across the Australian continent, which genetic and archaeological evidence now places at 65,000 years before present for the continent as a whole. 65,000 years of human presence in a landscape is 65,000 years of accumulated meaning. 65,000 years of camps and ceremonies and movement and knowledge accumulation and cultural transmission. The land does not bear all of those years visibly, because most of the evidence from the early periods has been erased by time, but some of it is preserved in the oral traditions of the communities whose country it is, in the archaeology of the sites that have been investigated, in the patterns of movement and association that have persisted even through the profound disruption of the colonial era. Into that 65,000 year accumulation, at a point somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 years ago, came something different. People who were not from the country, people who came by sea, over distances that the communities already on the land did not travel by sea. People who knew how to work stone in a specific way and had brought their tools for doing it. People who carried with them a processed material, a plant resin from a species that did not grow on the continent, and who applied it with skill and care around the edges of a door in a room they had cut into the bedrock, and then they left. The landscape recorded this, as landscapes record things, not in any form that can be directly read, but in the way that something different leaves a trace in the pattern of what surrounds it. The communities who lived on that country knew that something different had happened there. They knew that there were people before them who had done something in the ground in that place. They did not know in the way that they knew the things that were part of their own living tradition, who those people were or where they had come from. They knew the fact of it. They carried the fact of it forward across the decades and the centuries and eventually the millennia in the forms that their culture used for carrying such things. Then, many thousands of years later, other people who were not from the country came. These ones came from the other direction, by sea from the northwest rather than the north. And they came in numbers that the earlier visitors had not come in, and they stayed in a way that the earlier visitors had not stayed. They came with written languages and political institutions and a framework of understanding about what Australia was and what its history consisted of that had no room in it for sealed rooms in the bedrock, dating to 3,000 years before their own arrival. They built on the land, they grazed animals on it, they ploughed it, they built a school on it, and a surveyor named George Halliwell walked across it in 1843 and noted, with the slight impatience of a practical man, that his Aboriginal guides became reluctant near the creek bed and sought something he could not adequately translate about the ground not being empty below. The landscape biography of the area is still being written. Dr. Whitfield's work is part of the writing of it. The community consultations are part of it. The annual monitoring meetings are part of it. The ongoing genetic and linguistic research is part of it. The slow accumulation of understanding from all of those directions at once is part of it. The antechamber is the deepest layer of the human accumulation. It sits below everything that came after, below the school and the concrete and the colonial era survey lines, and the 65,000 years of Aboriginal presence and the occasional visits of maritime traders from the north. At the level where the story of human engagement with this particular piece of the Australian landscape is oldest and least understood. It is the oldest legible layer of a human story in a place where the human story is very long, and it is still sealed. The persistence of the seal is one of the most remarkable things about the site, and it is something that receives less attention than it might, probably because the attention has been focused on the more immediately dramatic questions of who made the antechamber and what lies behind the door. But the persistence of the seal across 3,000 years is itself a significant fact. It tells you something about the environment of the antechamber, which must have been stable enough in terms of temperature and humidity and chemical conditions to prevent the degradation of an organic material across that span of time. It tells you something about the quality of the sealing compound and the skill with which it was applied. And it tells you something about the absence of disturbance, because a seal that is disturbed and then resealed shows traces of the disturbance. And the seal at Harwick Primary, as far as has been possible to assess from the photographic record and the small sample taken in 1978, shows no such traces. Nobody has disturbed it. In 3,000 years, nobody has touched it. The communities who have lived on that country and who have known about its existence have not disturbed it. The colonial settlers who built the school above it did not know it was there. The boys who found it did not touch it. The engineer who photographed it photographed it, and left. The researcher who visited and took her sample was careful not to disturb the seal itself. Nobody has tried to open the door. This is not because nobody has been curious. Thomas and Barry were curious in 1961. The engineer was curious in 1978. Dr. Ashwood was intensely curious in 1978 and for the rest of her life. Dr. Whitfield is curious now. But curiosity and opening a sealed door are not the same thing. And the history of the relationship with this particular sealed door has been consistently one of restraint, of looking and photographing and sampling and analyzing and discussing and arguing, but not of the final physical act of opening. Whether that restraint has been conscious or unconscious, whether it has been driven by institutional caution or by the felt significance of what the seal represents, or by something harder to name, the result has been that the seal has remained intact. The oldest human artifact in the landscape biography of this particular place, the deliberate act of the people who came 3,000 years ago and sealed their door before they left, has been respected inadvertently or otherwise by every person who has encountered it since. There is something significant in that. Not necessarily in a mystical sense, though the elder who described the place as one where the old world is still shut in might have a perspective on it. But in the simple sense that a seal of such age, representing the intention of people who understood what they were doing and did it carefully, deserves a response that matches the seriousness with which it was placed. It deserves not to be casually disturbed. It deserves the full weight of the consultation and the legal process and the scientific rigor and the cultural respect that Dr. Whitfield and the monitoring group and the Aboriginal community organizations are bringing to bear on the question of whether and how it should eventually be opened. 3,000 years of patience deserve a response that is not rushed. The door can wait a little longer, not forever, but a little longer, until the conditions are right. Until the conversation has reached the point where opening the door is the right thing to do, done in the right way by the right people, with the right understanding of what it means and the right preparation for what might be found. The door can wait. It has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt its capacity for waiting. There are other doors in other places that do not have the benefit of having been found, photographed, and entered into the scholarly record. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the broader story that the Harwick primary antechamber represents. It is not almost certainly unique. The historical processes that might have produced it, the maritime connections, the transoceanic reach of ancient civilizations, the complexity of the human presence on the Australian continent across deep time, would not logically have produced a single sealed room in a single location and nothing else anywhere. The coastline of Australia is very long. The northern and western coasts, which are the most accessible from the maritime world of the Indo-Pacific, have been the subject of archaeological investigation, but not uniform or complete investigation. Large stretches of coast that were, in the period of the antechamber's construction, geologically different from their current form because sea levels were lower and the coastline extended further out, are now underwater, inaccessible to conventional archaeological survey. What lies under those waters, what sites were established on the coastlines that existed 3,000 years ago and are now beneath the sea, is unknown. On the accessible sections of coast and inland, the search for pre-colonial contact sites has been sporadic, underfunded, and often hampered by the same institutional resistance that characterized the initial response to Dr. Ashwood's work. The systematic survey that would be required to establish whether there are other antechambers, other sealed features, other material evidence of the maritime contacts that the non-physical evidence points toward has not been conducted and is not currently funded. This is a gap in knowledge that has real consequences, because knowledge, once lost, is very difficult to recover. Sites that are not known about cannot be protected. The natural processes of erosion and subsidence, the human processes of development and construction, act on unknown sites without any awareness of their significance. Something that has survived 3,000 years can be destroyed in an afternoon by a backhoe that does not know it is there. The Harwick primary antechamber itself was almost destroyed in 1987. The decision to pour concrete was made because the people making it did not know what they were dealing with, or if they suspected they did, they concluded that the construction timeline was more important. It is only because of the documentation that Canfield had already made, and that Ashwood had already published a preliminary version of, that the site retained even the reduced status it has now. If Canfield had not been thorough in his photography, if Ashwood had not been moved to write to a colleague, if that colleague had not retained her copy of the documentation and been angered enough by the concrete to call her, the antechamber would be as thoroughly erased from the accessible record as if it had never been found. It was not erased. It is there. The concrete is above it, but the room is below the concrete, and the door is in the room, and the seal is around the door. The monitoring group knows it is there. The heritage authorities know it is there. The Aboriginal community knows it is there. The researchers know it is there. It is in the record now in a way it was not in 1987. And that makes its eventual proper investigation more likely, not less. But the potential other sites, the ones that have not been found and documented, do not have that protection. They are in the record only in the most diffuse and indirect forms, in the oral traditions that may refer to them, and the genetic data that may reflect the populations that built them, and the linguistic traces that may point toward the languages of the people who visited. They are not specifically located, they are not specifically known, and they may not survive long enough to be found. This is an argument Dr. Whitfield makes it, for treating the Harwick primary investigation not merely as an end in itself, but as a proof of concept. If the investigation of this site, conducted properly and with the full engagement of the relevant communities and institutions, produces the kind of result that allows the existence and significance of such features to be formally established in the archaeological record, it creates the framework within which other sites can be systematically sought and, when found, properly protected and investigated. The knowledge that this kind of thing exists and the institutional infrastructure for dealing with it when it is encountered are both currently very underdeveloped. Developing them is part of the work, not a glamorous part, not the part that gets attention, but a necessary part. The part that involves writing grant applications and attending institutional meetings and navigating heritage law and building relationships and sitting in consultation meetings for hours and then sitting in more consultation meetings and then doing it again. The slow, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of building the conditions in which the important question can eventually be properly asked. Dr. Whitfield does this work. She does it because she thinks it matters, and because the question that the antechamber poses, the question of what Australia was in the deeper human past, of who was there and when and in what relationships with the rest of the ancient world, is a question that has consequences beyond the academic. It has consequences for how the country understands itself and its history and the peoples who have lived on it. It has consequences for the communities whose traditions carry knowledge about that history. It has consequences for the way the pre-colonial past of Australia is represented in education, in law, in the national narrative. Getting those consequences right requires doing the work, and doing the work requires the conditions that the slow, unglamorous building of institutional and community relationships creates. And so Dr. Whitfield does the work, and the monitoring group meets annually, and the heritage assessment continues, and the conversation continues, and the antechamber waits. And in the waiting, the question continues to accumulate its people. Each person who learns about the antechamber, as you have learned about it tonight, becomes part of the network of people who know that it is there. That is not a small thing. The antechamber has survived in the records and in the minds of the people who have held it, because enough people cared enough to hold it. The chain from Thomas and Barry to Robert Canfield to Margaret Ashwood to Francis Okafor to Priya Rajendran to James Carver to Claire Whitfield has been long and at times fragile. And it has held because each link in it was a person who cared enough to hold it. You are a new link. You know about the antechamber now. You know about the door. You know about the seal and the boys and the engineer and the researcher and the oral traditions and the genetic anomalies and the loan words and the Tamil maritime history and the photograph on the office wall. You know about the concrete and the monitoring group and the consultations and the landscape biography and the patience of the door. You will carry that knowledge somewhere. Not necessarily in the foreground, not necessarily consciously, but somewhere. And somewhere in the carrying, it will continue to exist in the world, in this particular form that knowledge exists when it is held in a human mind, which is a persistent and productive form, the form in which knowledge accumulates and connects and eventually, in ways that cannot always be predicted, generates the insights and the actions that push the story forward. That is not nothing. That is something real, something consistent with the long, slow way in which things like this move, in which questions like this are kept alive across years and decades, in which the work of understanding accumulates toward the moment when understanding is possible. The door is still shut. The question is still alive. The world is older than anyone told you, and you know it now. You know it in the dark, in the quiet of wherever you are listening from, in the particular state of half wakefulness that these kinds of stories reach you in, when the rational mind has softened its grip a little and the deeper mind is more accessible. In that state, the reality of an old sealed door in the bedrock of a continent becomes something you can feel as well as understand, something that registers not just as information but as significance, as the particular weight that real things have when they are very old and very incompletely understood. That weight is appropriate. The antechamber deserves to be felt as significant. It is significant. It is part of a story about who human beings have been across time, about the reach of maritime civilization before the era of written history, about the complexity of the human presence on the Australian continent across deep time, about the ways in which knowledge survives and is transmitted and is accumulated and is occasionally buried under concrete and has to be excavated again. It is part of a story about two boys who went somewhere they were not supposed to go and found something they did not have words for and spent their lives carrying it in different ways. One trying to get it right and never quite getting it right. one trying to get past it and never quite getting past it. It is part of a story about the researchers who took those boys seriously enough to follow the thread they had found all the way back through 60 years of accumulation to the moment when two palms pressed against a cold door in the dark, and forward through all the work still to be done. It is part of a story that is not finished. It is part of a story that you are now part of. The door is still shut. What is behind it is waiting. You should sleep now. The question will still be there when you wake up. It has been there for 3,000 years. It is not going anywhere. Sleep well. There is something specific about the year 1961 that is worth returning to. It was not a random year in the story. It was a year in which Australia was in the middle of a particular kind of cultural moment, one that shaped the silence that Thomas and Barry kept for 17 years in ways that are important to understand. In 1961, Australia's official history was a relatively uncomplicated document. The country had been settled by the British in 1788. Before that, Aboriginal peoples had lived on the continent for an undefined and largely unexamined prior period. The pre-colonial past was not taught in schools with any depth or detail, and what was taught reflected the assumptions of a colonial society about the nature of the peoples it had displaced. Assumptions that were, in most respects, wrong, and that have been progressively corrected, incompletely but meaningfully, over the subsequent 6 decades. In 1961, an 11-year-old Australian child who found something inexplicable in the ground beneath a school had no framework within which to report it. Not because adults would necessarily have dismissed him, although some would have, but because the available frameworks, the ones taught in schools and held in cultural currency, simply did not have a category for what he had found. A sealed room in the bedrock of a colonial-era town, built by unknown people at an unknown time, could not be placed in the story of Australian history, as that story was told in 1961. There was no slot for it, and things without a slot in the available story tend to get filed in this category of things that happened but cannot be explained, which is what both boys did, immediately and for years afterward. The story that has been told in Australia in the 63 years since 1961 has changed. It has changed slowly, unevenly, with the resistance that always attends the revision of foundational narratives. But it has changed. The depth and complexity of Aboriginal Australian cultures and histories is more widely acknowledged than it was. The pre-colonial period is taken more seriously in education and in cultural discourse. The evidence for the antiquity of human presence on this continent, pushed back by genetic and archaeological research to 65,000 years, has shifted the temporal frame within which Australians understand their country's human past. In a world where that shift had fully occurred, what Thomas and Barry found in 1961 might have been reportable. There might have been, somewhere in the institutional landscape, a slot for a sealed antechamber in bedrock beneath a school. It might have been possible to say this, and have it heard without the discomfort and the absence of framework that consigned it to silence for 17 years. That world does not yet fully exist. The shifts in understanding have been real, but they have not been complete, and the specific category of pre-colonial contact with Australia, which is the category into which the Harwick primary antechamber most likely belongs, remains contested and institutionally uncomfortable. The space in the official story for this kind of evidence is still being created, still being argued over, still being pushed open by the researchers and the community voices and the accumulating evidence that refuses to be filed away permanently. But it is being created, and that creation, slow and incomplete as it is the context within which the investigation of the antechamber is proceeding, and within which the question of the sealed door will eventually be resolved. The specific contribution that the Harwick primary case makes to that creation is not only evidential, it is also testimonial. The accounts of Thomas and Barry, preserved in the interviews Dr. Ashwood conducted in 1993, are witnesses to the experience of finding something that does not fit. They are witnesses to what it feels like to encounter as a child and then to carry for decades as an adult the knowledge of something real that the available frameworks cannot accommodate. That experience, the experience of knowing something real that cannot be spoken about because there are no adequate words for it, is not unique to Thomas and Barry. It is an experience that many Aboriginal Australians have had in the opposite direction, carrying knowledge about the deep history of their country in traditions that the dominant frameworks have been slow to take seriously. The convergence of those two kinds of witness, the witness of the boys who found the door, and the witness of the communities whose oral traditions have always known about the place the door was built in, is one of the most humanly significant aspects of the Harwick primary story. They are witnessing to the same reality from different positions, with different vocabularies and different timescales of awareness, but pointing toward the same thing. There is something in the ground in that place that is real and old and significant and not yet fully understood. The door holds that reality sealed within it. And the question of what is behind the door is a question about the depth of the human story, about how far back the connections run, about how much of the world's ancient maritime civilization reached into corners of the earth that the modern historical framework has assumed were isolated until very recently. It is a question worth asking fully, worth the slow, patient, rigorous work of building the conditions under which it can be asked fully, with the appropriate methodology and the appropriate relationships and the appropriate respect for everything that the site carries. The work is ongoing. The question is alive. The door is still shut. And the world, as Barry understood and Thomas understood in his own way, and as every person who has engaged seriously with this investigation has understood in turn, is older than anyone told us. It is older than the stories we have told about it. It is older than the frameworks we have built to contain it. It is older than the school that was built above the antechamber and the town that grew up around the school, and the colonial era settlement that preceded the town, and the surveyors who walked the land before the settlers came, and the European ships that first appeared on the horizon of a continent that had already been the home of human beings for 65,000 years. It is older than any of the names we have given to the things that happened on it. The antechamber is there, the door is shut, the seal holds, and somewhere in the dark and the quiet of the bedrock of New South Wales, in a room that has been sealed for longer than the concept of Australia has existed, something waits. Patient, old, deliberately kept, not lost, not forgotten, waiting, rest now. The question will still be there in the morning, as it has been there for a very long time, and as it will be there for however long it takes. The world is older than anyone told you, and it will hold that knowledge in the dark until the time comes to bring it to light. Until that time, the door holds, the seal holds, the dark holds. Sleep well. There is one more thread in this story that has not yet been fully pulled, and it connects to the question of what it means, practically and personally, to live above a sealed room you do not know is there. The children who attend Harwick Primary today arrive each morning, go to their classrooms, eat lunch in the yard, play on the equipment, sit in assemblies, learn things, argue with their friends, lose their jumpers, find their jumpers, do all the ordinary things that children at primary schools do. They do this above a room that was sealed 3,000 years before any of them was born, by people whose language, if they had one, has left only the most indirect of traces and whose names are completely unknown. The children are part of the landscape biography of the site without knowing it. They are the latest layer in a human accumulation that goes back to before any of the categories that organize their understanding of the world had been invented. This is not unique to those children. Everyone lives above something. Every house, every school, every building sits on ground that has a history reaching back further than the people who built it knew or cared about. Most of that history is not accessible and not particularly significant in the ways that a sealed antechamber is significant. But the general condition is not unusual. We are all living on layers. What is unusual about Harwick Primary is that the specific layer directly beneath it has been identified, partially characterized, dated, and entered into the scholarly and heritage records. The children there are living above something that is known in the limited way that the antechamber is known to be there. When eventually the heritage assessment process has advanced far enough and the community consultations have reached the appropriate point and the institutional approvals have been obtained, some of those children, the older ones, may be part of the community that witnesses the next step in the investigation of what is beneath their school. That is an extraordinary thing to imagine. A generation of primary school children being told, carefully and in an age-appropriate way, that beneath the ground where they play and learn, there is a sealed room that was built 3,000 years ago, and that researchers and community members are working together to understand it. A generation being given a piece of the real, complex, unresolved history of the place where they spend their days. A generation learning that the world they inhabit is older and stranger, and more connected than the official history has always implied. What would that do to a child? What would it be like to grow up knowing that? To carry from primary school onward the knowledge that the ground beneath your school holds a sealed door, and that behind the door something waits, and that the question of what it is has been asked by serious people for decades and has not yet been answered. It would be perhaps like being Thomas or Barry. Not the same, because the context is different, the frameworks are different, the language for it is more developed, but something similar in the essential experience of it. The experience of knowing something real that does not fit completely into the available story. The experience of carrying that knowledge, imperfectly, over time. The experience of hoping, or not quite daring to hope, that the question will eventually be answered, and the tolerance, or not quite tolerance, of the not yet. That is a good thing to learn. It is a hard thing, but it is a good thing to learn early that the world contains real questions that are not yet answered, and that staying with those questions is a form of integrity, is to learn something that academic frameworks often fail to teach adequately. The tolerance of not yet is a mature cognitive capacity, and it is built by encounter with things that genuinely are not yet resolved, And by being told the truth about that rather than a simplified version that forecloses the question, the children at Hawick Primary, when the time comes for them to know what is beneath their school, deserve the truth. The real truth, which is that there is a sealed antechamber in the bedrock, that it is old enough to predate everything they have been taught about Australian history, that nobody knows precisely who built it or what lies behind the sealed door, and that finding out is a serious and important project that is being pursued carefully and respectfully by the people whose responsibility it is to pursue it. That truth is complicated. It is not a simple story. It does not resolve neatly. It leaves you in the presence of a question that has no immediate answer, but it is real, and children are capable of holding real things, even complicated real things, even things that do not resolve, when the adults around them are honest about the complexity rather than hiding it behind a simplified version that feels easier to manage. The door is real, the question is real, the work to answer it is real, and the children who will eventually know about it are the next layer in the landscape biography of the place. The next witnesses, the next people to stand in relation to the question that Thomas and Barry stood in relation to in 1961, but with more context, more language, more institutional support for the standing. The world is older than anyone told them. When they find out, they will hold it the way human beings hold real things, imperfectly, persistently, over time. They will draw the pattern they half remember and never quite get right. They will try not to think about it and find they cannot entirely not think about it. They will tell their children eventually about the sealed door under the school, and the children will listen the way children listen, half attending, half somewhere else, but taking it in. And the knowledge will continue, as it has continued, as it will continue until the door is finally open and the long question has its answer, or as much of an answer as the evidence behind the door can provide, and the landscape biography of the site gains its next and most significant entry. The door is shut, the world is old, the question lives. You have carried it now for the length of this telling. It is yours to hold as long as you hold it, and to pass on when the time comes, in whatever form passing on looks like in your life. That is how things like this survive. That is how they find their way to the people who can eventually do something with them. The door waits. The world holds. Sleep now.